War crimes, possible crimes against humanity, and disproportionate force. Those are just some of the charges in a report on the Gaza war, now formally presented to the UN Human Rights Council. Israel gets most of the blame, but Palestinians, Hamas, are faulted as well. Both are accused of failing to distinguish between military and civilian targets. Israel refused to cooperate with the inquiry, calling it one-sided and shameful. Hamas called the report unreasonable. Each side said that it was engaged in self-defense. So will anyone face trial? And what is the role of international law in armed conflict? Joining me now here in the studio, Judge Richard Goldstone, lead author of the UN report. Judge Goldstone, thank you very much for coming in.
Pleasure, thank you.
I want to start by asking your reaction to the following. There are reports in the Israeli media, and we've asked the Prime Minister's office, about a possible plan this week to present to their cabinet, to his own cabinet, the establishment of a committee, an investigative committee, to probe the findings of your report. What is your reaction to that?
I would be absolutely delighted. That's really what we've asked for in our first recommendation. Is a transparent, open investigation in Israel and in Gaza into the allegations we make in our report.
Do you expect to get one in Gaza?
Well, I certainly hope so, and I think if Israel goes that way, it will put a huge amount of pressure on Hamas.
A huge amount of controversy about the report and about your findings. Do you believe that Israel deliberately, intentionally went out to target civilians?
Well, not as policy, and this is something we haven't looked into, and that is individual liability, criminal liability. That needs a fully fledged formal investigation by investigators, if necessary prosecution. This wasn't the purpose of our fact-finding mission. We weren't even quasi-judicial, and we certainly didn't get near being judicial.
The Israelis say that given the density of the population in Gaza, given the difficulty of distinguishing between military targets and those which are embedded, they say, inside the civilian population, they did the best they could to avoid civilians. This is what Prime Minister Netanyahu last week told CNN's Wolf Blitzer.
Well, certainly.
Let's just listen.
It's absurd. Israel was rocketed, pummeled for 8 years by thousands of rockets that came from Gaza. We tried to get at the rocketeers, at those terrorists firing those missiles and rockets, who placed themselves, embedded themselves in homes, in schools, in mosques, you name it. And we tried to target these people. We even sent them SMS text messages telling the Palestinian civilians, please get out of harm's way, cellular phones, you name it. So we did everything possible to minimize the loss of innocent civilian lives.
So one of the criticisms of the report is that it didn't do enough to highlight this fact of embedding military targets, military people in civilian areas, whether they be schools, homes, etc.
Well, it's certainly something we looked into, and the report didn't question the right of Israel to take action to stop the firing of rockets and mortars, clearly, as we held, serious war crimes. But what Prime Minister Netanyahu ignores completely, and what Israel has ignored, are our criticisms of the way they fought the war. We didn't second-guess generals. We didn't question the difficulty of fighting a war in a heavily built-up civilian area. What we did was question the degree to which innocent civilians were targeted. And also, I would add, the huge damage done to the infrastructure of Gaza, factories, bulldozing agricultural fields, bombing the only flour factory, and so on. Those are the sorts of aspects that I would certainly suggest are really calling out for investigation.
We're just going to now put up a graphic which shows the response by Hamas, because we do want to get at the what next aspect of your report. So the Hamas deputy prime minister there, Ahmed Youssef, says that it is a serious report. We'll look into some of the recommendations in the report about crimes committed by Hamas. Now, your report did criticize Hamas for the indiscriminate firing of rockets into Israel and targeting Israeli civilians. Again, do you believe that you went enough, after the notion of putting their weapon systems or their personnel anywhere near civilian targets?
Absolutely. We certainly looked into that. But in some cases, we assume that they may well have done that. We didn't find proof, any precise proof of that, but we assumed it might have happened. But even then, that didn't justify the sort of civilian casualties that ensued as a result of Operation Cast Lead.
Were you surprised by the reaction to your report?
Well, I was surprised at the tremendous criticism, and I think unfair criticism, that came out of some quarters in Israel, and also there were some Hamas spokespersons who criticized the report. You know, I wasn't surprised, but I must say the depth and venom of the opposition has been surprising.
The reason I ask you is because even some Israelis who feel that unless they investigate, they're going to get an international investigation. In the Jerusalem Post, shortly after the report was made public, one writer wrote that the kind of report that came out closed down what could be or should be a vital debate even before it got started because of the heightened nature of this precise report. He said, for instance, a debate about when does negligence become recklessness? When does recklessness slip into wanton callousness and then into deliberate disregard for innocent human life? This Israeli writer basically said that this is an area of legitimate debate, but because of the heightened feelings, it's probably not going to happen.
Well, you know, it seems now that there's at least a prospect of it happening, and certainly there has been an active debate. If one reads, and I have been trying to keep up to the best of my ability with the Israeli media, the report has opened a huge debate within Israel, and that's a very good thing. And I think it's opened a debate internationally, and it's certainly my hope that the effect of the report will have consequences in the future for the protection of innocent civilians in many places of the world.
Do you think it has an effect in terms of other prosecutions? For instance, there are people who say, including potentially members of the ICC, that some of what NATO or the US is doing, let's say in Afghanistan or in Iraq, the whole issue of civilian casualties has become huge in Afghanistan.
Well, that's correct, but the United States, I think, to its credit, has always taken care to protect innocent civilians. When innocent civilians have been killed and injured, it hasn't been because it was intentional. It may have been negligent. It may even have been, I don't know, I haven't looked into it. It may have been more than negligent, but I have no doubt it wasn't deliberate.
So again, are you saying that it was intentional in Israel?
Certainly, some of it was intentional. There was no mistake about the bombing of civilian buildings, the Legislative Council, the sorts of factories, food factories, which are civilian, that I was talking about. That wasn't an error. The Israeli army have very precise munitions.
To follow up there are some 100 investigations, according to the Israelis, that are going on, and some 23 or so that are possibly being brought to criminal trial. Does that go to what you're asking for, because you talked about individual responsibility?
No, not at all. These are secret military inquiries. In very few cases have the victims been spoken to. My understanding is that the Israeli military are relying almost entirely on what they get from their own forces. That's hardly the sort of inquiry that's going to satisfy victims.
I want to play also what Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State here in the United States, has had to say about the report.
We believe that the mandate for the Goldstone report was one-sided, and that many of the recommendations are appropriately dealt with by the institutions within Israel. Therefore, we believe that the appropriate venue within the international system is the Human Rights Council. We and other nations will be engaged about that, but we have grave concerns about the recommendations.
So first of all, grave concerns about the recommendations. What precisely do you think she means by that?
Well, she may.